I'm Nicole, and again, I have that slug of adrenaline, so bear with me while we work through it. With this talk, as Jordan said in the introduction this morning, it's really just a look back on the history of big spills in the United States and how they've influenced our legislation, or in some respects not at all, or how they compare with one another. And there's this idea that all these historians study history so that we learn something that will help us to deal with the present, right? And so we want to keep in mind how we've responded to spills in the past, what occurred during those spills, and maybe what we learned from them or didn't, and carry that knowledge forward into the future, because spills are going to happen. And so I have to say that my colleague Alan Mearns, who many of the OSPR folks know, was the first to put this presentation together, and he's a very curious, he has a very curious mind that is very wide-ranging, and so he looked at this and he came up with some really spooky things that have occurred or that are consistent across these spills. So this is a work in progress. I tweaked it quite a bit from what Alan did, but there are still bits and pieces of information that we continue to learn and try to add to this. So in this class already this week, you've heard about kind of the approach to spills that NOAA in particular takes. It's sort of the 5 big questions. What happened? Where is the oil going to go? Who's going to get hurt or hit by it? What are we going to do about it? And then I tweaked this question, what are the implications to the future? But really, it's kind of like, why do we care? What matters to us about this? And kind of the net environmental benefit analysis. What's more important to protect? What are we going to carry forward into the future? What did we learn from these things that happened in the past? So here's a little star at the corner. We're going to talk about one spooky thing here. So the first spill that we'll kind of look at in this, we're actually going to compare them side by side. So this is the 1969 Platform A spill off the coast of Santa Barbara. It inspired a lot of public outrage, and from that spill, we actually had quite a lot of new legislation introduced. NOAA was formed. The same year or in the immediate years following, we had some major environmental laws put into place: National Environmental Policy Act, Endangered Species Act, Clean Water Act, although it had a slightly different name at the time. And some of those things, not all of them came as a direct result of Platform A, but it was sort of a cumulative, wow, what are we doing to ourselves and to our environment? We need to change things. So in 1979, in the Gulf of Mexico, down the Bay of Campeche, there was actually, and I might have said that wrong, excuse me if I did, Campeche. There was a platform blowout that actually spilled nearly as much oil as the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And in fact, in this spill, there was almost the exact same amount of dispersants used as there was in the Deepwater Horizon spill. But we've forgotten our own history. So when Deepwater happened, across the entire world, it's, oh my God, we've never seen such a spill of this size, when in fact we had in 1979, in fact, in the Gulf of Mexico, and in reality, not that far away. Then we had the Exxon Valdez, which you guys have heard about, which was the biggest spill to that point in time in U.S. waters, in U.S. marine waters. And that, too, inspired a lot of new legislation, or some new legislation, most notably the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. And then, of course, we have the Deepwater Horizon spill, which, again, there was a lot of outcry because we've forgotten our history, or the history. Biggest marine oil spill in the United States, unprecedented use of dispersants, death of the Gulf. We have a lot of environmental concern and outrage. To this point, there's been no major legislation that's come out of Deepwater Horizon aside from the Restore Act, which is directing a large portion of the funds that come out of any settlements around Deepwater Horizon to be used in the Gulf of Mexico for restoration. But no major changes to the way that we inspect platforms or what we require in terms of response capabilities or a variety of things along those lines. So the spooky thing about this is if we look, every 1 or 2 decades we have a pretty big spill in the United States, right? 1969, 1979, 1989, then we had a little bigger gap, 2010. But the reality is that there are spills happening all over the world, and they're pretty big spills happening all over the world. They just haven't necessarily caught our attention here in the United States and under that. Yes?
It might be a stupid question, but lower right, 2010 Deepwater Horizon, what's the function that those boats are?
Down here?
What capability? What are they doing there?
They're trying to put out fire.
But is it?
Sorry.
It seems as if like that.
That was just a response, I guess. I'm sorry, I don't understand what your question is.
Oh, okay, yeah, no, I mean, wet stuff on the red stuff, put it out. But it seems as if like that wouldn't, like what they're doing would. I was wondering if there was something besides trying to like put out the fire that they were accomplishing there.
Not to my knowledge.
Not to my knowledge.
Actually, they're not going to put on a line fire with water. Not certainly that line of fire. What they're trying to do is cool the metal structure.
Cooling the metal structure.
Thank you.
And
prolonging the continued collapse.
expand the response time. Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Jordan, did you have something you wanted to add? Okay. So we had our thing there every few decades, big spill, or decade or so. This is just to help orient where these spills happen. Platform A here off the coast of California in Santa Barbara. Ixtoc, again, Gulf of Mexico, down Bay of Campeche. Exxon Valdez up in the Gulf of Alaska. And then Deepwater Horizon, which was about 50 miles offshore of the Gulf of Louisiana, or the coast of Louisiana. So here's a little spooky thing. If we look at where these spills occurred, both Exxon Valdez, Deepwater Horizon, and Exxon Valdez occurred at the apex of the Gulf. Gulf of Alaska, the Gulf of Mexico. And those gulfs actually have kind of similar dimensions. So here's the question, what got spilled? We look at Santa Barbara spill, about 2.3 million gallons plus or minus of a fairly heavy crude. Deepwater Horizon, or Ixtoc, you see 144 million gallons, again, plus or minus, right? These are estimates of a Mexican crude, a little bit lighter, quite a bit lighter actually, than that was spilled at Santa Barbara. Exxon Valdez, an Alaska North Slope crude, between those two. And then Deepwater Horizon, 172 million gallons on the water, and this being the lightest oil of all. So that number you see has a question mark next to it with a little asterisk. So in part, we don't know for sure. This is continuing to be fought out in the courts at this point in time, exactly how much oil was spilled and who knew when that volume, or who knew at what point in time how much oil was actually coming out of that well. The fact is that we probably will never know exactly how much oil came out of there. But this number is also, I know you guys have heard bandied about the number 200 million, 205 million, plus or minus again. And this number only reflects what was actually in or on the water, because about 34 million gallons of oil was actually recovered directly from the wellhead via their little straw recovery system. And so we know that there was about 34 million gallons recovered that was shipped elsewhere. So, you guys have been hearing about oil chemistry, oil all week. Who can tell me, based on the API number of these oils, what's going to happen with that oil? Is it a floater or a sinker? Floaters. Are all of them floaters?
Yeah.
Yes. But if you recall, an API of 10 is the same specific gravity as seawater. So that number, this Santa Barbara crude is actually very heavy oil. Right? And then the spooky star thing here is that 3 out of 4 of these big spills that we're talking about are platform spills. And, this is kind of important to keep in mind. After OPA 90, we had the implementation of double holes. And we have seen, as a direct result of that, a decline in tanker spills. And it's not to say that there aren't spills, and there certainly are. But there are a lot of platforms out there. And again, the regulations, there are a lot of regulations in place around those. But the reality is that we continue to go further offshore, into deeper waters, into much more challenging environments. And so that's important to keep in mind as we look at the future of drilling and spill response, looking at what's happening up, say, in the Arctic, that is starting to open up and exploration going on there. Very challenging environment in which to respond. Lots of unknowns up there. And then, out in the Gulf of Mexico, starting to drill in 10,000 feet of water. I mean, those are deep, hard places in which to work. So things are going to get more challenging on the response side too. So again, going back to our questions, where did this oil go? These are, none of these have, or maybe a couple of them have scales on, but mostly we're just looking at this to try to get an idea of that really these spills covered anywhere from tens to thousands to tens of thousands square kilometers. This was the Exxon Valdez spill, covered a lot of the Alaskan coastline. Here's a graphic that shows the Ixtoc spill and kind of how the oil was distributed as a result of that. And we had oiling on the Texas beaches, and pretty heavy oiling actually as a result of that spill. And then the Gulf of Mexico, Deepwater Horizon's spill footprint. You can see these boats are pretty large. Santa Barbara, which the footprint of it was actually fairly small. A lot of that oil ended up on shore because it was close to shore, very close to shore. And then this one is also Ixtoc. So here we are. I just mentioned that Santa Barbara spill was close to shore. Here we are, approximately 5 miles offshore, and about just shy of 200 feet of water. Lasted 11 days, and then plus 7 months, right? We had a lot of response going on during that time. Ixtoc lasted approximately 3 times as long as the Deepwater Horizon. It was only 25 miles offshore, that platform, and it was in shallow water, 150 feet, versus 5,000 feet for the Deepwater Horizon. Exxon Valdez, big volume of oil released in an incredibly short amount of time, and you heard about that already earlier this week. And again, Deepwater Horizon, only 84 days, but 200 million gallons of oil out of a well that was under extremely high pressure and really pumping out at a very high rate. And about 50 miles offshore, which is actually still pretty darn close. Okay, so big spills, what happened? What kind of area did we have in terms of the area covered on the surface of the water and the amount of shoreline oiling that occurred as a result of these spills? And so you can see that the estimate for the Santa Barbara spills is about 800 square miles had oil on them on the ocean surface. Ixtoc, 62,000. Exxon Valdez, this is a question mark. And I don't think that with that spill, it was an instantaneous release, 11 million gallons, but the weather whipped up, that oil emulsified, and it got whipped down with the currents. And so it happened all very quickly, and I think there's the reason that there's question is because it all happened so fast, and some of the areas were very remote and hard to get to. So again, it's just a question. And the Deepwater Horizon, roughly 30,000 square miles covered on the Gulf of Mexico, in the Gulf of Mexico by that spill. So, what do we see for shoreline oiling? If you look at the heavy category, I think this is actually kind of amazing to look at. Santa Barbara spill, again, much smaller relative to, say, Ixtoc or Deepwater Horizon, but still, 35 miles of shoreline that was heavily oiled. Very thick oiling. And then another 200 that falls into the moderate to light to very light category for a total of 235 miles. Again, plus or minus a little bit of shoreline that was oiled as a result of that spill. Ickstock, we don't know. Most of that oiling occurred on the Gulf, on Mexican shores. And there was a lot of study actually that was done after that spill, but there's not in terms of what were the effects on biological resources, habitats, even economic impacts. We know that there was a lot of study done as a result of that, but PEMEX, the Mexican government controller behind the drilling, actually suppressed quite a lot of that literature. So it's out there somewhere, but it's not public per se. But we do know that we had oiling again on the Texas beaches, and very thick oiling. You'll see a picture a bit later of some asphalt pavements that formed as a result of that. Exxon Valdez, 1,300 miles of shoreline oiled, 11 million gallons. Look, Deepwater Horizon, 200 million gallons, and we're right in the ballpark, 1,100 miles of shoreline oiling with that. What I want to say, having been scout coordinator down on this spill for 2.5 years, I'm out of that now, thankfully. But I will say that the response is still going on, and there's still nearly 1,000 people working that response. This, I think, is incredible that only 224 miles of shoreline were heavily oiled as a result of that spill. Of this moderate to light, the majority of this number, like 600 some miles, actually falls into the light to very light to trace categories. And so again, you think about 200 million gallons of oil floating around on the Gulf of Mexico out there. These are, I think, really incredible numbers. I don't want to necessarily speculate on why it's less. We were very lucky for sure with the weather and the freshwater outflows out of Mississippi at that time. But this is just a pretty amazing comparison. So here we are. This is Santa Barbara spill. You see out here lots of people on the beach. They actually used straw or hay. I think it's a hay. Do you know what, Josh? Hay or straw? One of the two. On the beaches to absorb the oil, and then they'd rake it up and have big bonfires of that oiled material. This is the Ickstock spill. This is down again in the in Texas, on the coast of Texas. You can see these asphalt pavements are very thick, heavy, dense oiling. This is Exxon Valdez. We saw pictures earlier this week. And then this is down at Deepwater Horizon. There's an area called Bay Jimmy in northern Barataria Bay, Louisiana, that was the most heavily oiled area anywhere on the Gulf Coast. And what happened out there is the oil came in, thick mats of oil laid down on the marsh surface. In some places you have moose that's 6 inches deep that looks like, even today, if you dig under the sediments, that looks as though it was just freshly laid down. So it came in, laid down the vegetation, or oiled the vegetation. As heavy waves came in, sheared that vegetation off, carried the rack back into the marsh, oiling the marsh vegetation as it went. And so you have these big areas here where we ended up actually using a industrial hedge trimmer to slice through those oiled mats of vegetation and lift them out. So how much of the oil volume was actually on the shoreline? You see this, I think, is amazing too. Again, Santa Barbara spill, fairly small relative to these others, but greater than 50% of that oil, roughly, plus or minus, who really knows for sure, but greater than 50% is estimated to have actually landed on the beach. Again, that was a close inshore spill, only 5 miles off the coast. Lots of oil on the shore. Ickstock, these should have question marks next to them too. We don't know for sure, but roughly, less than 10% of the oil on shore. Exxon Valdez, again, a huge amount of that oil ended up oiling the shorelines. Deepwater Horizon, we may never know, again, what that total volume of oil is on the shoreline. lots of processes going on there. Not a lot of there's data all over the place on who was collecting what where, but it's very disjointed, and of the debris and the sand and tar mats and whatever that was picked up off the beach, no one was taking that and actually calculating what percentage of material was oil versus sand, say, out of the tar mats that were collected. That did happen later, but in the earlier days, not to any very well organized extent.
You want to hazard a guess about how much would end up on the shoreline? Would it be above 50%, high numbers?
Well, Alan and I were talking about this, and we think that it's a far less amount of oil for sure than the Exxon Valdez. I mean, if you just think about the total mileage of shoreline that was oiled, Exxon Valdez, 1,300 miles, Deepwater Horizon, 1,100 miles, versus in comparison to the volume of oil that we're looking at, it has to be, relatively speaking, incredibly low percentage of oil. But we don't know, and we probably will never know for sure. There's definitely lots of people out there thinking about it and talking about it, but the official guesstimates have not been released, and probably won't be released, I would guess, until after litigation has been resolved, and may not be released at that point in time. Because again, it's I'm going to say it's not complete speculation, but there's definitely best professional guesses going into that, which can be quite good, but they're not going to be put out there at this point. And again, we may never know. So what kinds of habitats were oiled? Santa Barbara, we have lots of public beaches, rocky intertidal, offshore islands, Ixtoc, sand beaches, marshes, and mangroves, which from your ESI lesson earlier this week, are the most sensitive habitats. And it's interesting because there are people from the U.S. who went and studied Ixtoc spill, and actually Deepwater Horizon inspired some of those folks to go back down to the Bay of Campeche and take a look around, and they dig down, they do dives and look in the near shore. There are mats of oil underneath the sand that are not weathered. They look like they were very recently laid down, except they're buried under a layer of sediment. And then again, in the mangroves and the marshes, you can still find that oil under a layer of detrital material. Exxon Valdez, mostly exposed or rocky, exposed and protected, a lot of sheltered bays, got oil, rocky, gravel, intertidal habitats. Deepwater Horizon, marshes, mudflats, lots of amenity beaches. Actually, not lots of amenity beaches, but you would think, based on the attention given to those, that it was really terrible on the amenity beaches. But in reality, not bad. And again, from earlier this week, you heard, if we're going to have a spill and then we need some place to clean it up, we'd much rather have it be on the sand beach. The mayor or the local officials don't really want that because it ruins their image of, hey, come to our beautiful powdery beaches, white powder beaches on the Gulf Coast and enjoy and spend your tourism dollars. But from a response perspective, we like oil on sand beaches because we can take heavy equipment out there, scrape it off the beach, and be done with it. Or if you have a beach that's a high enough energy environment, push it into the surf as a clean, as a polishing. We wouldn't do that as a wholesale dump heavily oiled sand out into the surf, but scrape your oil off, but what remains slightly oil or stain behind to be churned up in the surf and cleaned. So just to say too here, and someone's going to keep me on track time-wise, but all of these had big slicks associated with them, emulsified oil, tar mats, tar balls, and buried oil in the beaches. So what kind of people and resources were used to respond to these spills? Santa Barbara, about 1,000. Not much boom deployed, 54 vessels. Ixtoc, we don't know. I don't know where Alan pulled this number, but I know he got it from a source somewhere. I told him he has to go back and list sources for some of this data. But he said about 1,000 feet of boom. Exxon Valdez, which he lived and breathed, roughly 10,000 people, 250 vessels, 30,000 feet of boom. Deepwater Horizon, 47,000 people. 47,000 people. And again, there's about 1,000 people nearly 3 years later still working that spill response. greater than 6,800 vessels deployed, 11 million feet of boom put out there, and Josh can tell you all about that.
Is that partial or both?
Both.
What are they still doing down there, roughly?
Cleaning beaches, there's cleaning beaches, cleaning marshes. There's a lot of places that are actually, that meet the cleanup endpoints that are just waiting to be signed off out of the system. This was touched on earlier in the week. In fact, I think a couple of folks with local jurisdictions came up and talked about it afterwards. This idea that, well, once it's clean, you're not going to come back. And that's been a real holdup down in the Gulf, in particular, Gulf of Mexico, for ending spill response, because there's so much fear that the oil is going to resurface, or, thank you, the media and unqualified scientists who spoke about these lurking underwater rivers of oil that are going to come out and be that oil. People think there's these rivers of oil out there that are going to be stirred up in the tropical storms or hurricanes and tossed up on the beaches. And it's very hard to get past that misconception. So there's lots of places that could be moved out of response that haven't been. There are some beaches where, on the amenity beaches, where people are finding one tar ball the size of the end of my pinky finger for every kilometer or so that are still in active response because they are not being signed out.
I have a question related to that. Having lived in Norway for 6 years, there's a lot of pre-existing pollution in those areas. And so how much of your cleanup is focused on pollution derived from Deepwater Horizon and versus pre-existing pollution?
So did you guys hear his question? This question is, what level of background oiling are we cleaning essentially versus oil from Deepwater Horizon? The SCAT teams are actually very skilled at recognizing Deepwater Horizon oil to this point. And with like 90% accuracy, they can say that's Deepwater oil and that's not. The nature of the tar mats and tar balls, we actually don't call them tar mats, we call them surface residue mats and surface residue balls, because they look quite different than an actual tar ball. You pick up a tar ball, you break it open or pull it apart. It's crusty on the outside, but inside it's gooey still. Deepwater Horizon tar balls, surface residue balls or mats, you pick them up and they'll crumble apart because they're like 85% sand, and then the rest is oil. So the teams are very good at recognizing what's Deepwater oil, and only Deepwater oil at this point is being picked up. The problem is
pressure to pick up pre-existing.
Yeah, but yes, because people don't recognize the difference. But on the amenity beaches, I only have 5 minutes left, so we got to move on, guys. The amenity beaches on the Gulf Coast, they're cleaned beaches anyway. It's not like they're in a natural state. People go out and they clean them off in the morning so they look pretty and white for the tourists that come and enjoy. So they're picking up background oil anyway as a result of that. But the Deepwater Horizon response is no longer cleaning background oil. Okay, on water removal, we're going to start moving here. Was there skimming? Yes, for all of these. You can see the millions of gallons skimmed. 7 million gallons out of the 144 million plus or minus that was spilled in Ixtoc. 7 million gallons, approximately the same number, you note, for the 200 million plus or minus gallons that were spilled during Deepwater. Very small amount for, relatively speaking, for Exxon Valdez. Santa Barbara, I'm not sure. Was there burning? Not for Santa Barbara, except for waste on the beach. Ixtoc, yes. Deepwater Horizon, yes. And lots of oil removed by burning via Deepwater. Lots of waste generated. What was the percent skimmed? Deepwater Horizon, roughly 4%. Ixtoc, almost 5%. Exxon Valdez, 8%. And then you note, again, burning was a fairly large percentage. And it's hard to wrap your mind around this. It's percentages that we're looking at. This is a lot of oil. It's a lot of oil skimmed and burned. It's just a lot of oil out on the water. Okay. So Santa Barbara, we don't know for sure. There may have been some sink oil that got entrained with sand in the near shore and sunk, forming mats don't know that for sure. Ickstock, again, oh my God, there's this underwater river of oil with Deepwater Horizon. Nobody expected such a thing or knew such a thing. Well, actually, the same exact thing happened during Ickstock. People who work oil spill response were aware of that. You work in the spill response, you don't necessarily aren't having the time or energy or the permission to go out and speak to the press about this. And so then other people come in and they're like, oh my God, we never saw such a thing. Well, we did. We've seen it before. We've seen it in studies that SINTEF, an organization out of Norway, has done in the North Sea. Anyway, so we had subsurface plumes of oil. Shoreline cleanup straw, manual mechanic cleanup, and Ickstock, as far as we know. And then manual, mechanical, all kinds of things going on with Deepwater Horizon. Hydraulic, again, they're flushing. What stopped these leaks ultimately? Well, look, we tried all kinds of new things, we thought, right? People said, oh, we never tried this before, Deepwater, but that's not true. We did a top hat during Ickstock. We did junk shots. They did junk shots during Ickstock. And they did a relief well, which was the ultimate answer in Ickstock as it was for Deepwater Horizon. Again, spill legislation or changes to legislation that came out of these spills. I mentioned this already, so I'll move on, except to note that, again, we have a lot of dispersant investigations going on as a result of the unprecedented use of dispersant at Deepwater Horizon. Again, kind of Ellen touched on this yesterday. There's actually quite a lot of data out there around dispersants and dispersant impacts and dispersed oil. There's always going to be more questions. And so this unprecedented use is set off a firestorm of questions. So public outrage, what happened? Here's President Nixon actually looking at the beach in Santa Barbara. There's the Exxon Valdez ridicule poles built by Native communities to draw attention to what happened in the wake of the Exxon Valdez spill up there. Troubled on the international political scene, which, for a little while was potential with Deepwater too, because again, people who don't do oil spill modeling were like, oh my God, England and Ireland are going to get smeared with oil as a result of this spill. And then this is just interesting because this is a big grounding that occurred. I've forgotten which boat it is, so I didn't get a chance to review this morning. But you'll see this gigantic gash here. Thanks to the double hole, there was no spill as a result of that grounding. There's lots of research that came out of particularly Exxon Valdez. Again, there was a lot during Ickstock. Most of that's been suppressed. And there will be huge numbers of papers coming out of Deepwater Horizon. They're starting to be out there. As a scientist, the caution I would give to you is that there are a lot of people who are good scientists, but not oil spill scientists, that are doing that research. Some of the assumptions that they built into the analysis of their data, from my perspective, are wrong. They haven't taken into account what we truly do know about the state and effects of oil. And so what they're publishing in some respects is I'm not going to say bad science, but it's not well-reviewed science. And then there's lots of literature that comes out of these. These are books, a lot of them that came out of Exxon Valdez and some out of Ickstock. And then who knows who's actually reviewing the children's literature that's out there. I looked at a book that was published by Scholastic in regards to Deepwater Horizon and just wondered, it was green, because it wasn't that it was wrong in what it said, but the implications around what they said, the way they wrote it, it painted a whole different picture of than what's reality. Kind of again, focus on the death of the Gulf. So where do we get most of our spills in any given year? We see a large volume of spills down here in the Gulf of Mexico, and fairly good-sized spills, which was a source of frustration, again, in response that there's a lot of spills that happen in the Gulf of Mexico, particularly off the coast of Louisiana. There's a lot of background oil in those environments. Not 200 million gallons all at one time, but the system does get a lot of oil, and there's natural processes in place, Kathleen spoke to, bacterial communities, degradation of that oil. If we didn't have those things going on, the Gulf of Mexico, and I think Jordan said this, would have been paved from coast to coast a long time ago. So where'd all this oil go? It's not calculated. It's not on as far as it wasn't on the shore. It wasn't collected. Most of it, was degraded, as I just mentioned. But some of it's in the near shore, in tar mats, buried. Some of it's buried on the beaches. You guys dug your trenches out in our SCAT exercise the other day. Imagine a beach that stretches for 30 miles that's been oiled. You're going to dig a lot of trenches. And in fact, down on the Gulf Coast, on beaches, on some of them, there's very systematic augury going on to try to locate the needle in the haystack, the subsurface oil mass. Rachel Maddow had a big thing on MSNBC at the height of the spill on a rant about how the same technologies as were used during Ixtoc in 1979 are the exact same technologies that we used in 2010. Yes, there have been some increase in effectiveness in different types out there, but relatively speaking, pretty minimal. We've been doing a much better job of burning. And, we have double holes, so tanker spills are decreasing. But those are an instantaneous release, often occurring in very sensitive habitats, i.e. potentially the Gulf of Alaska or on up into the Arctic. So I said this already, who's looking at the school books? Who's paying attention to our history? Because, we keep running around, chicken little, sky's falling, we never heard of this before. And this is Alan's thing. He's actually ready to retire. But I tell you, if it happens again very soon, I will retire. So I think that's it. Yeah.